Hello, scholars. I hope that you are implementing what you learned from part one. We are still on research development process. And as I earlier mentioned, the research development process doesn't mean so many details, but to run you through the whole process from the beginning up to the end, what is expected from it's like a roadmap. We are setting a roadmap which you have to follow step by step until you get things done. So I'm speaking from Johannesburg, and I'm at the Kopanong Conference Center. That's where I am. Kopanong is a Sotho word for a meeting place. So I've come to meet you to share some few insights, perspectives about how to go about doing your research. So I already talked about how you present your titles, and also how you work on your introductory chapter. And I believe that we are moving forward together. If you are watching this as a non-participant in the course, you are still most welcome to engage with us as we'll be sharing a lot of insights on research process. So share your perspectives and we're very glad to engage you. You will be most welcome if you're an expert in the field to come and share with us a public lecture. So having looked at the background or the introductory chapter where we said you need to put a background, the thesis statement, the problem statement, the purpose or the aim of your study, the objectives, the research questions, and all hypotheses. You need to talk about significance of the study and so on and so forth. After you've done that, you now need to go into the next segment where you present your review of literature. Now, we are not here to overlabor the point on literature review because that is something you're going to look at, but we should know that it's a second chapter that follows. And in other institutions, you'll find that the background or introductory chapter is combined with literature review. It doesn't matter. But if you look at everything in research, we can say everything is related to everything else when you're doing your research. So there is no like one item that exists on its own. All aspects that you'll be working on are connected. So from introductory chapters, like you're continuing with the story, you go into literature review. So when you're doing literature review, you're not merely describing what others have done. Just like the word itself, review, you are looking at what other scholars have done. So do not merely describe, Muchanga 2024 says this, or Lawson says ABCD, or Laura 2050 says ABCD. No, you need to critically engage with what other scholars are doing, what they have done, and identifying the gaps. Put together, you identify a overarching gap which you know that your study is going to bridge up. And in some universities, actually, the objectives and research questions actually come after literature review. Why? Because you would have identified the gaps from which you're going to create the research questions and all objectives. So, but there are these variations from institution to institution. So you need to be alert to these differences in styles. But if you find that the generic components are preserved. So literature review is a critical appraisal of what other scholars have done in relation or related to your proposed personal topic. You are critically appraising what other scholars have done, not merely describing them. So appraise, don't describe. When you're presenting the review of literature, take note of the fact that you are making critical reflections and comments about other scholars, but do not use review of literature to belittle what earlier scholars have done. You are just building your perspective and your case. So you need to be ethical as you review, and you need to make comments in such a way that you are building up on the already existing knowledge. You're contributing. You're not trying to put everything aside, but you're building on what others have already said. So you need to be ethical when you're presenting this. Note that when you're presenting your review literature, styles may vary. Sometimes you may present it using thematic aspects from your research objectives. For example, if you have 3 objectives, each theme, you may want to review it separately. You need to review it separately to check what have been the gaps around this theme. And this for this reason that I was telling you, in other universities, objectives come at the end because you'd have identified a gap. And based on that gap, you frame an objective so that when you conduct your study, it will come to bridge up the gap. I would love to hear your perspective on this. So that's something that I would recommend. You use the thematic way of presenting your review of literature. You check your objectives, put that heading and check what has been done around this from the global perspective, from the continental perspective, from the national context, or you can even talk about regional context before coming to the national context. So for example, you may say, okay, African context, what has been the general picture, what has been done and what has not been done. Then you come to the SADC region where Zambia is located, or a region where your country is located. You check what has been done. Then you narrate or scale it down to your country context, and even from the context of the specific geographical area where you're going to do your research, because you may find that there are other scholars who would have done studies around your topic in that same area, and you want to say, okay, there's this missing link, even though there's been so much study that has been done. For example, I've been doing a lot of studies in the Magoe catchment, and there's one thing that has not been done. We have done recommendations and so on, and somebody may come with an action research to restore the degraded riverine environments of the Magoe River. That is bridging a very significant gap in the same area where there's been so much. Even yourselves, where you are, I would actually recommend you to that kind of a research at PhD level, action oriented, applied. Instead of problem statement, you go and check what is the existing problem on the ground. Oh, recommendations have been done, but no actions. And the status of the degradation of the buffer zone remains. So you are coming in with a PhD to regenerate the buffer zones using nature-based solutions and other interventions. And that's a PhD. And you can document a very good paper out of that. So that's just an example where you come to specific context. You check what has been done, you appreciate, but at the same time acknowledge the gap. Yes, there have been so much research, but all these have just been kind of basic, recommendation based, but you are coming in with action using participatory methods with the communities, and you find that you can regenerate, restore what was initially degraded. So you go theme by theme and check what is the gap under this theme and how will your study bridge up these gaps. Then, towards the end, we expect that after you've done your review of literature, you need to now do a synthesis, because you are citing hundreds of papers, even thousands of papers when you are reviewing your literature. And you can't go one by one talking about a gap you have seen there. Those are just small dots now, which must be brought together so that you build one strong case of the gaps. What's the overarching gap across literature? And then you put that as your case, showing what you're going to bridge up through your research. So don't forget, when you're doing literature, you need to manage your citations and references very effectively. You can use Mendeley, you can use it as Zotero, and there are many other AI-based tools that can help you manage your citations very effectively. Make sure that this is done simultaneously. Do not go to AI and say, do a review of literature on such and such a thing. What is going to happen is it will start guessing and it will give you false citations. If you're using AI to improve your literature, basically maybe the readability and the grammar, not necessarily that AI can do a review of literature. And one of the best ways to actually do a very good text review of what others have done is to use systematic review. It's a more robust process. where you set specific tenets that you'll be looking for, and it has a very specific model called Prisma to model and check what has been happening. And if you use artificial intelligence tools, they will show you the clustering of what has been done for different thematic areas around the overall topic that you're working with. So try to work with them so that they can help you. Very soon we'll be looking at application of artificial intelligence in the review of literature and general research practice. So be on the lookout. That is on the 2nd of April. That's when we'll be doing this. So be on the lookout. You'll be dealing with another lecturer who is specialized in artificial intelligence. So we are looking forward to that. And make use of AI in enhancing your research, but do not ever use AI as your master. Use it as your servant to help you just clean up, improve the readability and clarity of what you want to say grammatically, to remove grammar errors and so on. But don't ask it to do what you must be doing. It will not do it. It will make a lot of mistakes, and that will be detected. After you have finished doing your review of literature, that is a chapter on its own. You now need to build another case, which is another chapter called the conceptual theoretical framework. Again, as I earlier mentioned, we are not going into details because we'll come back to these as topics on their own, but just to show you the flow. So conceptual theoretical frameworks have for a long time been confused to mean one and the same thing, but they don't mean the same thing. In fact, if you read from this book, if you read from this book, there's been a very good explanation. There's been a very good explanation of the differences between conceptual framework and theoretical framework. When do you use them? Can you use them in one study? There have been studies that are showing, no, you can only use one, but there are a lot of studies that are confirming you can use both depending on the nature of what you want to investigate. So you want to read through again under conceptual framework and theoretical framework from this book. I got about 20 books which have been ordered by colleagues here. So there will be these books, there are about 20 copies there remaining here in South Africa. There'll be some which will go to Kenya, others Malawi, others Namibia. So if you have never bought this copy, they'll be finished very soon. You need to buy one copy. So you find that when you're presenting your conceptual framework and theoretical framework in one chapter, you are building now a case. Now, how do we build a conceptual framework? A conceptual framework is not a borrowed concept or framework. No, it is unique and originated by yourself as a researcher. So you don't want to go out there to start borrowing people's conceptual frameworks. No, it shows you have not understood what you're doing. A conceptual framework is simply defined as a system of concepts that are connected to each other, and you want to assume the relationship among them and how they're informing the thinking within your research process, because conceptual framework will actually predict what kind of objectives you have, the way you actually collect your data, and the way you're going to analyze it. So we should be able to see, when you look at your conceptual framework, we should be able to say, oh, this is how the study is going to even collect the information, or this is how the methodology is going to be. We are able to predict how the discussion is going to be. It fits within those key concepts and the relationships that you have established among the variables that you have identified. A theoretical framework is just a theory informing your study. So you need to identify which theory can best dress up my study. And then from there, you'll be able to search and search and search depending on the nature of your may say, oh no, behavioral science theory, or social learning theory, oh no, expansive learning theory, appreciative inquiry. There are many theories out there. So you may want to study widely to see which theories, even from the literature review, have other people been using. So from the theoretical framework, from the literature review, from personal experience, and also the study findings you put together, you may actually build up a very good conceptual framework that showcase how your study is being operationalized, what the theoretical meaning behind it is. If you don't do that, you are going to actually miss the point. And in strict institutions, you may be failed outright, because a thesis without a conceptual framework is lacking a theoretical meaning. So you need to do that. You want to read a paper by the title Overlooking the Conceptual Framework. I also made use of that paper when I was putting up a book together. But you want to go read, and of course we'll come to that point where we'll start doing a lot of reading about each and every concept, so that we assimilate and understand and have the ownership of the science of doing research, especially at PhD level. So from literature review, we go to the concept and theoretical framework. It's a separate chapter. You have to go in details. And when you present the conceptual framework, do not just dump as a diagram. You need to give us what's the theoretical meaning, provide explanation with reference to different literature sources. You will soon be engaged by another lecturer who will be talking about this in more details. So you need to know that your study must have this aspect as a separate chapter. If you're working with just conceptual framework, it can stand as a chapter on its own, and expand it properly, inform it with literature, and let it have meaning. Because at the end of your discussion, this will have to still come back. In your methodology, there will be some elements that have to be influenced by the way you have structured your conceptual framework. If it's a theoretical framework, likewise, do it clearly. If you're combining, that's also acceptable, depending on the nature of your study. When you are done with the conceptual and theoretical framework chapter, given the nature of your study, we expect another chapter that is talking about description of your geographical area where you'll be doing your research. If you're doing your studies, I've seen studies that will be done in Southern Province, Northern Province, Western Province, Central Province, Lusaka Province. Well, that's fine. But if you're doing your study from wherever, which part of the world, you need to provide that geographical context so that people appreciate, from which geographical area was this done? Or from such and such a place. Because when people look at the significance of your study, they also look at it from the context of geographical setting where it was done. Is it relevant to do such a study in such a geographical area? I'll give you one basic example. You can't go and study the impact of excessive flooding in deserts. People don't appreciate that. What are you talking about? Because deserts receive extremely little amount of water. And for a desert to experience a flood, that should be a lot of rainfall beyond expectation, because sand burden absorbs water like no man's business because of high porosity. So if you do such a study, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't have geospatial relevance or significance. But if you talk about the aridity, how aridity is affecting socioeconomic activities in the desert and how to navigate that, that is a very relevant topic to that geographical setting. So you need to be very clear on that. So that chapter on description of the study area is also important, because you have to provide the detailed understanding of the geography of that area where you're doing your studies from, because the geography, socioeconomic background influence the nature of the problems. You'll find that even the way you're going to do it, even the ethics they're going to adhere to may be influenced by the geographical background of that area. So if you're doing a study that is tailored towards environment, climate change, sustainability, we would love to first appreciate the geographical details behind that area. While some studies may just show a few details of maybe the location and the name and maybe a few background text, in our context, we need a very detailed description with good maps indicating the location and other details that may add a clear geographical understanding of that area. Those will be appreciated. But in general sense, we'll come back to this. When you're presenting the study area geographically, you need to, one, provide the physical characteristics of that area. And the physical characteristic of that area that you're going to include depend on the nature of your study. There are some that may be skipped, there are some that must always be included. For example, if you're talking about location under physical characteristics, if you're talking about location of your study area, that is always a must, irrespective of which study. People want to say, where is this located? But there are other variables under physical characteristics that you may skip. But for the nature of your studies, most of the variables will actually be there. And I have tried to explain these in this textbook, and you may actually pick, it's like a basket full of these variables to be considered under physical characteristics. And then you need to talk about the socioeconomic background of that area. What socially and economically characterize that area. After you've done that with good citations and references, you need to justify why out of all places did you choose that area. That's very important. So after you've done that, we are heading towards another chapter, which is methodology. So in methodology, sometimes you may combine the philosophy of science and the methodology together. But at PhD level, at masters, that can be fused under methodology. But at masters, you can fuse philosophy and methodology. But PhD, you want a separate chapter. So which will come immediately after description of study area chapter is philosophical framework of your study. You cannot skip this component of your research. Why? Because you're doing Doctor of Philosophy. And in terms of applications, we'll come back to details. How do you go about applying the philosophy? But I will run you through very quickly. So that chapter which is talking about philosophical framework is just basically where you clearly explain details of the philosophy behind the philosophical framework that is informing your study. Mind you, if you say, no, I will skip this, it's like your methodology is naked. Why am I saying so? When you read scholars like Zonders, and I've also explained this in this book, why is it important to start with explaining the philosophical background of your study? It's because the question of methodologies and methods is secondary to question of paradigmatic frameworks or philosophical frameworks. So you will not skip that phase, especially if you're doing a PhD. But even at masters, I just say that at masters you can combine these, but at PhD, let the philosophical orientation of your study stand alone as a chapter. You have to go in details explaining what that means to the context of your study. So when you are dealing with a philosophy, we want you to identify what philosophy is informing your study. What is the name of the philosophy? Secondly, what are its ontological and epistemological assumptions? What is the ontology behind this philosophy? I'm not defining that today, but we go in details later on. What does each epistemological assumption mean to my study? And thereafter, you may explain the axiology. Now, axiology is a very important dimension that must not be ignored in the study. Why? Because it's the one that will influence the value and ethics that you're going to adhere to in your study. So I may ask you to say, what philosophical assumptions informed your choices of ethical considerations in your study? And if you fail to answer, it shows you didn't articulate or you didn't understand quite well the axiological assumptions behind your study. So it's very important to study these simultaneously. So these three must complete your philosophical stance. And you need to not just explain them theoretically as they appear in the textbook. You need to do what we call recontextualization. In this book on page 88, there's a summary of different philosophical frameworks. And on page 71, that's where you see the starting point for the chapter that is specifically focusing on the use of philosophy in research. So you need to engage and study very carefully. Don't skim around anything. And if you go to AI, trust me to not do what I'm talking about. Because there's this high temptation among students to be using AI wrongly in an ethical way. No, you need to use AI ethically. If you misuse it, you may end up being penalized and even failing. So when you go to this chapter on page 71, going on up to its end, you will see a concept of recontextualization. To recontextualize, to give the contextual meaning behind these philosophical assumptions that you're talking about, not to just state them as they were stated in the book. You need to apply them. What does this statement mean to my study, to my methodology, to the way I will look at reality and to interpret it in my own study context? You may find that there could be a number of supervisors, colleagues, and scholars who may not fully understand these things. Please take advantage to educate them. They may even say, that doesn't apply in our context. That's not true. There is no research. Take this as it is said. There is no research that can be done without philosophical orientation. Some are explicit, some are implicit. They all are there. So, studies that are focused towards social science, they use what we call ARA ontology, referent ontology. Whereas those that are biased towards physical, natural science, they use what we call epistemological ontology. These are not the same, but they are related. So we need to understand the application, and all those concepts are clearly explained. We'll come back. We are just talking about the process. It's to prepare your mind or give you a roadmap up front of what is expected of you when you're presenting your work. Anything missing, we are going to question you. Why didn't you do it? So when you know that, the philosophical framework has been now well done, you need to justify why have you picked that philosophical framework out of all others that exist. So don't come across one and say, this is the one I've been looking for. No, you are running away from study. In fact, you have to first study everything. As much as you can discover and find, study all the philosophies. And based on that study, then you can choose which one is the best to inform your study. Don't just come across anything and say, this can inform my study, that can inform my study. That is not correct. It's a very first starting point to show that a person, a PhD student or master's who doesn't study. You need to critically analyze every philosophical framework and see which one best fits your work. Because we may ask you questions to say, why, for example, did you pick positivism instead of interpretivism? So if you didn't study interpretivism, you can't answer that question properly. If you didn't study positivism, you can't answer a question on interpretivism. So it's very important that you study all the philosophical frameworks. Because I may ask, perhaps I will ask that question for you to be able to relate why this stands out of all others. After you've done that very convincingly in a scholarly at high level of analysis, then you go into the methodology. And under methodology, you need to show the research approach that you used. There are 3 research approaches. We have the qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods. So you need to pick one, but we are not saying study only one. Study all of them and see which one can apply to my research context. So when you pick one, then go inside it. If you have picked, for example, qualitative approach, you need to go inside and check what specific research designs are found in this research approach. Again, study as many as possible so that you're able to compare, no, this one can't work, or phenomenology cannot work better, maybe case study may work better, or no, grounded theory. That's basically the kind of thinking we want and the engagement at PhD level. You need to study everything, then pick the best. The Bible says, taste all things, prove all things, hold fast to that which is good. That's the same principle in academic. Study, taste, prove all things, but hold fast to that which makes sense to your study. That's the idea. Don't just study everything without making a choice. Study everything, but eventually decide on which you are going to work with. So if it's qualitative, pick what specific design inside there and why is it the best compared to others. How are you going to use it in your context? After you have identified the research approach and the specific research design, we expect you to define what your population is. Where are you going to do your sample from? Which population? Is it the group of small-scale farmers, or large-scale farmers, or medium-scale farmers? Just as an example. Okay, you would have identified this and described their characteristics. Then from there, you need to explain what the sampling method and techniques will be. You need to explain that. So you check how these are cascading from research approach, you go to research design. From research design, you describe the population that you be, targeted population. And then from targeted population, you look at the sample. What sample are you going to work with? And what sampling technique will you use to extract that sample from the overall population? After you have explained this, and you have shown how you do the sampling, and we will talk about details of probability and non-probability sampling techniques as we go. After that, what you need to do? You need to now prepare to collect data because you have identified the accessible population that you want, or it will be 10 or 50 or 60, but the size depends on the approach that you have adopted, the design that you're working with. There are designs that will just require maybe 5 people, and that is enough. I know positivists will tell you, no, that is not representative. That's not what you're looking at. Albert Einstein says that not everything that actually counts is countable, and vice versa. Not everything that is countable counts. And that's one of the ontological positions of a philosophy called critical realism. So do not be swayed by the numbers, because you may have thousands of numbers that add nothing to your scientific development. So understand what kind of study are you doing and what you want to achieve with that. So you would have decided on the sample size using the appropriate techniques and methods. Now you need to collect your data. What data do you want to collect? What tools are you going to use? You need to describe that. Why are you even going to use such tools and methods in your collection of data? That must be clearly described. After you've done that, clearly describing the tools you will use and go objective by objective. I have seen this error again in many studies where I say data was collected using a questionnaire. Data was collected using, are you sure all the studies, all the objectives require a questionnaire? Does it even sit well? I've seen even in qualitative studies, somebody saying, I will use a questionnaire, or the questionnaire was used. No, you don't use a questionnaire. For example, in a qualitative study, that's a quantitative tool of data collection. So you need to be very clear on that. So make sure that you do a proper description of how you will collect information for each and every objective. Clearly define, explain how you go about using that tool you have mentioned to collect the information. Do you need primary and secondary data? Primary is what you collect yourself in the field as one-on-one on your own, but there's secondary information collected by others but remains unanalyzed. For example, rainfall records. Those are secondary data sources. They were just collected like in their raw state, so you can get them and analyze them to make a case. There are a lot of colleagues who are doing this in epidemiology, demography. They are working so much with secondary data. But the challenge with that is that if there were errors in the way data was collected, you will have to move those errors. So that's why it's important to try to collect your own data, maybe complemented by secondary data where it is necessary. After you have explained the data collection, you need to explain methods of data analysis. How are you going to analyze this data? Again, we have the quantitative and qualitative mixed methods way of analyzing data. So you need to be very clear explaining this. After you have explained the data analysis way of, the way of analyzing the data, you are already moving forward to look at how will the data be managed. Data management is very important. How will you keep the records such that you can do what we call raw data audit? from the processed, we can go backwards and be able to see, oh, this is where this analyzed data is coming from. So data management and quality control is now a very important requirement even when you're publishing. You need to show how did you manage the data? How will you manage the data? Which database are you going to use to keep this data as long as time lasts? Because people may demand, can we see the raw data that inform this analyzed output? So keep the data very safe somewhere and explain clearly how you'll be doing the management of the data to allow for audit trail of your data. That adds trustworthiness to your data, and it can be validated by others. It can be checked and tested by other scholars to confirm whether your analysis was correct or not. That's very important. And after that, talk about the issues of validity and trustworthiness. If you're dealing with a quantitative study, you may talk about data validation techniques. If you're dealing with a qualitative trustworthiness and quality, describe how you would ensure validity of your findings. What are some of the potential validity threats? And then if you're dealing with a qualitative, talk about trustworthiness. What are some of the major threats to trustworthiness of your data? And how do you plan to mitigate these as you go about collecting your data, analyzing it, and finally writing your report? That's very important. After that, you need to talk about ethics. Remember, I talked about axiology. Explain clearly the ethical considerations or ethics that would inform your research process. After you've explained the ethics, do not just quote them according to what and so on. Each ethical consideration applied in context. Let there be contextual application of the ethics and so on. This is how the ethical considerations will be like. And last but not the least, under methodology, we expect that you upfront identify what are the potential limitations in your study. Are there potential limitations in your study? If they are there, make sure that, in fact, there's no study without limitations. Now, these limitations don't say there's no money. Why are you starting a study if you have no money? You need to check what are the limitations embedded in the methodological choices and decisions that you have made. And then from there, you need to identify these limitations and then put mitigation measures. After you have done your research and you have written your report, you may want to actually check also in the analysis what gaps, limitations have you noticed, identify those, outline them, and maybe make recommendations for further study to bridge up those gaps. Remember what I mentioned earlier on. Your research simply addresses one problem and creates 10 more, even 50 more. These have been said severally by many scholars, so we cannot stop researching. We can't end our research because there is always a gap out there. After you've done your presentation of your methodology, the next is one of the most exciting. Present your findings, your results. We'll be able to discuss the difference between results and findings, but whichever way you prefer until that day when we debate. So present your research findings or research results, but there are two different concepts, these two. But for now, we'll do it that way. If you prefer to use research findings, use that. Research results, use that. So show the research findings and present them in accordance with your objectives. Under each objective, what is coming out as the output or the results? And give these results a clear context, not that you're discussing them. Just give them a context so that if someone reads the text about your result, they're able to relate. So, okay, this is the reason why this person is saying this. Do not merely repeat the percentages for those who use percentages, because this has been another mistake, but we'll come in details. So you present your findings, and after findings have been presented, you go into your discussion of your results or findings. When you're discussing the findings or results, you need to not just discuss your results, you need to cross-reference them with what other scholars have done, specifically referencing the sources or literature that you reviewed. Remember literature review? You now want to bring your findings with what other scholars have done and make observations. Are there points of convergence? Are there points of departure? What are the theoretical, conceptual compatibility or contradictions? tensions, are you able to address these through your research? That's very important. Besides that, you need to bring forward the philosophical, theoretical aspect that you earlier on presented. What do they mean now to your findings? Do your research discussion or discussion of finding even resonate very well with your conceptual framework? If there is a contradiction, you may want to tweak the conceptual framework so that it speaks to the way the results have come out. And that's why a conceptual framework is a tentative framework. It has to keep changing depending on eventually how the results have come out. That's very important. And you will find best practices when you're discussing qualitative results, quantitative results, or mixed method results. Make sure that you are highly synthesized in your thinking. Don't just describe, but analyze, engage in a discussion, comparing your thoughts with other people's thoughts. That is going to add a lot of value. And as you go towards the end of your discussion, try to do what we call data mining. Go deeper into the deeper layers, the unobvious out of your discussion. What are the unobvious implications behind what you have discussed? So show the theoretical, philosophical, policy implications of your discussion of findings before you go into the last part where you're talking about these conclusions and recommendations. And conclusions becomes very easy to do if you have done a proper presentation of your results and discussion. So conclude your study. That's the last chapter. Conclude your study and make recommendations. And these recommendations must be based on key research findings. Don't put hanging recommendations. And after conclusion and recommendation, you already know what you're talking about. It's an exciting part. Finish up your references. Put all the content that belong to the appendix or the annex. And that's how a research process looks like. As far as this course is concerned, there could be other layers depending on your different levels of engagement with research or institutions where you'll be doing studies from. But generally, this is the generic structure and process of doing research. You may find, this comes earlier than the other, but you'll be able to confirm wherever you will go to do your research academically, you'll find this is the generic process. So I hope that this has been helpful and you use it effectively. We'll be going now section by section out of all these details that have been explained, section by section in more detail so that you know how to apply. But I wanted to make sure that you already understand the whole structure from the beginning up to the end. So thank you very much, and don't forget to study. You need to make a schedule of studying because you have study timetable, personal study schedule. If you can study at least not less than 25 papers in a quarter, or even 50 per quarter, that would be very good, so that you are going to have about 100 papers per. But those 100 papers are not even difficult given the new technologies. So once you learn about artificial intelligence application, you'll not have problems to do thousands of papers within the shortest possible time. So see you in the next series.